Okay, so for this deep dive, we're really going under the surface of a period that, well, it basically laid the groundwork for modern English society.
It really did. But
Mhm.
we're not focusing on the usual suspects, are we?
No, not the kings and queens, not the big battles. We're zooming right in on something. Well, something much more fundamental: the English medieval village.
And the sheer scale of it
Yeah.
is staggering. You're looking at a population that just exploded. It might have gone from, say, 1.5, maybe 2 million people at the Doomsday Survey
Right.
to well over 4 million by the early 14th century.
That's an incredible boom. And our sources really hammer this home. The village was, and I'm quoting here, the primary seedbed of population.
It's a great phrase. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a number. This was pressure. It created this intense pressure cooker on resources. Every single patch of land that could be farmed was farmed
Pushing the whole system right to its absolute limit.
to the brink. And that's where our story really begins.
Absolutely, because what we're looking at today is what happens when that relentless pressure, that demographic engine, meets a total catastrophe.
Not just one, a whole cascade of them.
Exactly. Floods, famines, plagues, wars, one after another. And they don't just bend the old social order, they completely shatter it.
This is the story of why the great peasant rebellions happen. It's the story of how the very foundations of English life were completely reshaped.
And it leads ultimately to the birth of something new, something we'd recognize today as, well, modern economic individualism.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to extract the key turning points in this huge 300-year transition.
We're tracking the life cycle of the medieval village from this highly regulated cooperative world.
To something driven entirely by market forces, by land ownership, and really by raw ambition. We're going to watch how that quiet communal world just dissolved under the weight of history.
So to really get a handle on the Black Death, which is what everyone thinks of, we have to start a bit earlier.
We do. Because there's this common assumption that the plague hit a stable, healthy society in 1349.
And that's just not true.
Not at all. Our sources make it crystal clear. The medieval village was already deep in crisis. That huge population boom we mentioned, it had pushed the agricultural system way too far.
The system was fragile, brittle even.
That's a perfect word for it.
Mm.
And that incredible growth was stopped dead in its tracks by a series of disasters that kicked off around 1315. This is the first great calamity, the Great Famine.
And the sources, I mean, they're just chillingly specific about what this famine, this flooding actually did between 1315 and 1317.
It wasn't just a bad year. That's the key thing to get across. We're talking 2 catastrophic harvests, back to back.
And it might have been linked to a bigger climate shift, right? The start of the Little Ice Age.
That's the theory. The rain just wouldn't stop. And it wasn't just flooding, it was cold, wet weather. It meant the grain, the wheat, and the oats, it just wouldn't ripen on the stalk.
So what's the immediate effect of that?
Economic chaos. You get hyperinflation of food prices. Grain prices just soared to levels described as unparalleled in English history.
So if you're a small farmer, or worse, a landless laborer.
You're facing immediate starvation. You have no reserves. You have no cash to buy grain at these insane prices. The market just prices you out of survival.
And it's not just a financial crisis, it's a public health nightmare.
Absolutely. The sources confirm it. Widespread illness, especially things like typhoid, which just thrive in poor sanitation and among people weakened by hunger.
And of course, it's the poorest families who are hit first and hardest. They're living on the worst land and the most vulnerable houses. They're first to starve and the first to get sick.
But what's really revealing about this whole pre-plague crisis is how the ruling class, the lords, reacted. It's not what you'd expect from a feudal system.
No, it's not about charity or noble obligation. It's cold, hard calculation.
Exactly. And the comparison our sources make is fascinating. They acted, and this is a quote, like latter-day governments and business firms in a deep recession.
So what does that mean in practice? What did they do?
They cut costs drastically. They reduced almsgiving to the poor. They laid off their household staff, their famuli.
And the big one, they stopped delivery of grain.
That's the crucial bit. That's the regular food provision they owed to their servants. The whole feudal relationship is supposed to be reciprocal, protection and food in exchange for loyalty and work.
But when the crisis hit, they backed out of their end of the deal.
They did. They laid off workers and slashed their spending right in the middle of a massive humanitarian crisis, which just made everything 10 times worse for the very people they were supposed to be protecting.
So the whole social contract is fraying from the top down, and the breakdown of order just spirals from there.
It does. And it wasn't just the humans who were suffering. The entire agricultural economy was under attack.
On multiple fronts.
Right, so you have the crop failures. Then, on top of that, you get these outbreaks of severe murrain.
Which is a kind of catch-all term for cattle disease, right?
Exactly, mass cattle disease. So you're losing your protein, your dairy, and critically, you're losing the oxen you need to plow the fields. For a peasant family, losing your ox could mean you're done. You can't plant next year's crop.
And that level of desperation, it leads to a breakdown in law and order.
No question. The sources show a sharp rise in theft. Food, livestock, anything people could get their hands on to survive. The system wasn't feeding them, so they turned to crime.
You even have reports of bodies of the poor just being found in the streets, unburied.
And this is where it gets really dark. And you can see how close society was to just total collapse. The sources give these raw, visceral details.
What kind of details?
It's documented that dogs and cats started disappearing from villages.
Eaten.
Presumably eaten, yes.
Yeah.
And then there were the rumors of cannibalism. Now, whether it actually happened on a wide scale is debatable, but the fact that people were even talking about it.
It tells you everything you need to know about the level of desperation.
It does. This was society hitting rock bottom. And remember, this is all years before the Black Death even shows up. The world was already broken.
And that brokenness wasn't just about immediate chaos. It was also showing up in these slow, long-term changes to how farming worked.
That's right. There were these big structural shifts already underway before 1349. And they're really important because they determine how everyone reacted to the even bigger shock that was coming.
So what were they? What are these big shifts?
Our sources point to three main ones. First, there was a clear move away from traditional crop farming, growing grain, and towards something much more profitable.
Sheep.
Sheep grazing. Wool was becoming the big export, the engine of the economy, and it required a lot less labor and a lot less community organization than growing wheat.
A huge warning sign of the commercialization of land.
Definitely. The second shift is related. Lords started to pull back from managing their own land, their domains, directly.
Instead of running the farm themselves, they started leasing it out.
Exactly. They preferred to just become landlords and collect rent.
And the third change follows from that. More and more of the actual farming was being done by the peasants themselves, as tenants or leaseholders, not as laborers working for the lord.
Right. So if you put those three things together, you see the Lord's role is already changing. He's slipping from being this, hands-on producer-consumer.
The guy managing the estate, eating the food from it.
Right, to being just a rentier, a landlord. His main interest is the rent check. The sources do note he still had a large appetite, of course.
But that's a huge psychological shift, isn't it? If your income is just rent, you're less invested in the day-to-day survival of your tenants or the cooperative health of the village.
Precisely. Your financial interests and their survival can actually start to diverge, and that really foreshadows the conflicts to come. The whole table was set for the Black Death to come in and just sweep the pieces off the board.
So if the famine was the long crack in the foundation, the Black Death was the earthquake that brought the whole house down.
Perfect analogy. It sweeps through England in the summer of 1349. It's carried by rats and their fleas, which are everywhere, in every house, every barn. And the depopulation it causes is just unimaginable.
The estimates are what, 30 to 50% of the population?
In that range, yes. And it completely shatters the old economic logic overnight.
Because the feudal system was built on a simple equation: lots of labor, not much land.
And the plague just flips that on its head. Suddenly, labor is incredibly scarce and valuable, and land is everywhere. It's cheap.
And for the lords, this is a disaster. The sheer number of empty farms means they can't collect rent, they can't enforce the labor services they depended on.
And look, the most powerful evidence we have, it comes right from the source. From the manorial accounts themselves.
His dry, boring ledgers, right?
Exactly. And suddenly they read like a dirge. List of the dead, written in the language of accounting.
So let's get into some of those specific entries. They paint an incredible picture.
They do. You see the collapse of the basic farming unit. You find entries like 23 vergets in the hand of the lord vacant.
And a verget, just to clarify, that's a pretty standard family landholding, enough to live on.
It is. So 23 of them being empty means 23 families are just gone, wiped out. And the Lord has no one to work that land. That's a huge loss of production.
And they track the dead by name, don't they, through the missing rent?
Yes, line after line. Rent lacking from 11 cottages by reason of the mortality in the preceding year. And then the specific names. Of the rent of Robert Amos, nothing here for the cause above said. Of the rent of John Soutier and William Abbott, nothing here for the cause aforesaid.
It's a roll call of the dead.
It is. And what's so tragic is how bureaucratic it all is. You see an entry about a piece of land and the clerk just writes, and the reeve answers for 2 shillings 6 pence from Robert Beadle for 12 acres of domain land formerly of Hugh Prest, lately deceased.
Hugh Prest is gone. His land is immediately reassigned. The account moves on. The human cost is just boiled down to shillings and pence.
And it wasn't just the farmland. The whole infrastructure of the village started to fall apart. You get these devastating little notes in the margins.
Like what?
From the fulling mill, nothing, because it is broken and useless. A fulling mill was essential for the wool trade. It's a core piece of commercial machinery.
Gone.
Gone. Or the common ovens, where everyone baked their bread, are reported as ruinous. The smithy, where you repair your tools and plows, fell down. The basic services just ceased to function because there was no one left to run them.
Even the personal feudal fees, those small, often humiliating payments, just vanish?
Right, because the people who paid them are dead. There's an entry that says, of chevage nothing, because all the chevagers are dead.
And chevage was a tax on villeins living away from the manor.
Exactly, a tax on movement. Or in another entry notes, only 3 capons, 3 chickens, were collected that year as a feudal due. The whole system was just hollowed out.
And this must have had a huge social impact on the survivors. The burden of traditional duties would have been immense.
Unbearable. Take the job of the reeve. He's the guy who has to run the manor for the Lord, collect the rents, organize the work.
Suddenly, that's the worst job in the world.
The absolute worst. Because you're legally on the hook for the Lord's quotas, even if half your village is dead.
Yeah.
In the village of Elton, the records show 3 different guys held the office in the single year of 1349-50.
That turnover rate tells you everything. People were desperate to avoid the job. Nobody wanted to be left holding the bag.
And that desperation, that lack of willing labor, translates directly into massive costs for the lords. They still had a harvest to bring in, but they couldn't rely on the old system of unpaid customary labor anymore.
The market had taken over?
Completely. And you can measure it. Cash expenses for wages just exploded. You see entries like, in diverse workmen hired by the day to mow and lift the Lord's hay, 17 shillings 5 pence by tally.
They're paying market rates for day laborers for work they used to get for free.
Right. And the harvest, the most critical time of year, becomes this huge, expensive logistical problem. The records show the cost of hiring help. Expenses of 40 workmen coming at the bailiff's request to one repast. They had to feed them well.
And then the boon works, those big mandatory feudal work parties.
Become bigger costs. We see notes about 2 boon works of the autumn on each occasion of 90 workmen, and the Lord has to feed all of them. And even then, it's not enough. He's also paying diverse other workmen hired for lack of customary tenants.
The whole system had just seized up.
The numbers are stark. Grain production on the Ramsey Abbey manors, a huge landholder, was cut in half. Just like that.
The economic reality was just.
Yeah.
It was simple and it was inescapable.
And revolutionary. Mass death meant land values plummeted, and the price of labor, the wages of the survivors, inevitably skyrocketed.
The peasants suddenly had all the leverage.
They did. And of course, the lords and the crown fought back against this new reality with everything they had.
They tried to turn back the clock.
They did. They tried to strictly enforce what was left of the old labor services. And then they went to the king to try and legislate away the laws of supply and demand.
Which brings us to the Statute of Laborers in 1351.
A truly remarkable piece of legislation. It tried to fix wages at the old pre-plague levels. It demanded that any able-bodied person had to accept work at that suppressed rate.
If you refused.
The stocks, or prison. But the sources are very clear about what happened next.
It didn't work.
It was a total failure. It just created a huge black market for labor. Lords were paying higher wages under the table just to get their fields harvested. And crucially, it didn't cap the price of goods.
So your wages are legally frozen, but the cost of everything else is still going up.
Exactly. It was seen as a profound injustice. And it did nothing but stir up this deep, simmering resentment among both tenants and hired laborers. A resentment that would eventually boil over.
So on top of this struggle over wages, this new economic reality, the state comes along and just piles on more pressure.
Immense pressure. In the form of taxation for the 100 Years' War.
And to really understand how crushing this was, we need a bit of context. Royal taxes, these lay subsidies, used to be pretty rare.
Very rare. They were for emergencies. A king like Henry III only collected them 5 times in his whole reign. Edward I and II, even with the wars in Scotland, only 16 times.
But Edward III comes along and just completely changes the game.
Out of wartime necessity. The war in France was incredibly expensive. He needed money for ships, for soldiers, for everything. So between 1334 and 1377, he calls for that tax no fewer than 24 times.
It goes from being a rare emergency measure to a constant expected burden.
A constant drain. And he also changes how it's collected, which has this really interesting divisive effect inside the villages.
What did he change?
He basically outsourced it. He gave each village a quota and said, you figure out how to collect it.
So the power goes to the local village officials.
Right, to the better off peasants, who are the reeves and the constables, and allowed them to arrange the tax burden in their own favor.
Shifting it onto their poorer neighbors.
Exactly. So it just deepens the economic divisions that are already forming within the community. It pits peasant against peasant.
So the tax pressure is constant and it's unfairly distributed. And it wasn't just the main subsidies either.
No, there were other costs. Villages had to pay for the equipment for their own army recruits. But the real flashpoint, the thing that finally broke the camel's back, was a new experimental tax.
The infamous poll tax.
Introduced in 1377. And it was radical because it was a flat tax. 4 pence per head on everyone over 14, except for, genuine beggars.
Which is completely different from the subsidy, which was based on wealth. The poll tax just taxed your existence.
It's profoundly unfair. A rich merchant pays the same as a landless farmhand. And look how often they levied it. The first one is in 77. Then in 79, you get a second poll tax on top of a double subsidy.
And then the final straw, 1381.
A third poll tax, this time on top of a subsidy and a half.
The sources mention this little detail about a pious request for the rich to help the poor pay it.
Right. A request that we could be pretty sure was widely ignored. So you have this final crushing tax demand plus decades of resentment over the statute of labors. It was the perfect powder keg.
And it explodes into the Peasant Rebellion of 1381, Wat Tyler's Rebellion.
And while the tax was the trigger, our sources are quick to point out this was part of a bigger European trend. A whole chain of peasant uprisings directed against taxation was exploding across the continent.
But the English Rebellion had a special kind of ideological fire to it.
It really did, thanks in large part to the Kentish priest, John Ball. He provided this revolutionary social and spiritual message that took it way beyond just being a tax protest.
His Sermon to the Rebels is one of the great documents of the age.
It's an incredible manifesto for equality. The gist is simple and devastating.
Right.
Things can't go right in England until goods are held in common and there are no more villains and gentlefolk. He's attacking the entire class system.
He makes the contrast so vivid, doesn't he? He talks about the lords and their velvet and ermine, eating spices and fine bread.
While the rebels have rye and straw and drink water and toil in the fields. And he says very plainly that the noble's luxury comes directly from our labor.
And this leads to that famous rhetorical question he posed.
When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, a brilliant, simple challenge to the whole idea of inherited nobility, he also declared that servitude itself was against the will of God.
So the rebels took that ideology and turned it into concrete demands.
Their aims were twofold. First, economically, they wanted the abolition of villanage, of serfdom. And second, symbolically, they wanted to destroy the records of their servitude.
Which is why we see all the bonfires of manorial records from Norfolk to Kent, and the targeted killing of lawyers who they saw as the agents of that oppressive system.
But there's a fascinating paradox here that modern historians have uncovered.
Which is that the rebellion wasn't strongest in the most oppressed areas.
Exactly. The revolts tended to spring up not in the regions where the serf was in deepest oppression, but in those in which he was comparatively well off.
So it's not the most beaten down people who rebel. It's the ones who are doing a little better, who can see freedom on the horizon.
Right. They were strong enough to aspire to more, and they had the resources and organization to fight for it. The rebellion was fueled as much by ambition as it was by desperation.
Now, the rebellion itself was crushed pretty brutally. The entire upper-class crown, nobles, rich merchants, they all united to put it down.
They did, but it left this permanent mark. The message was sent. You can only push the common people so far.
And there were immediate consequences.
There were. The hated poll tax was gone for good, and the statute of laborers was basically left unenforced. The elites realized you just couldn't fight the market anymore. It was too costly and too dangerous.
And the whole process of serfdom withering away just sped up everywhere.
The rebellion accelerated the inevitable.
So the rebellion fails to create this new world of total equality, but it definitely speeds up the end of the old one. And in England, the legal end of serfdom for the villein class comes about through this quiet, slow legal process.
That's right. Not through another big revolt, but through something called copyhold tenure.
Which sounds a bit dry and legalistic, but it's actually revolutionary.
It's one of the most important and maybe most misunderstood changes of the whole 15th century. It's a complete reversal of how the law worked, and it comes directly from the fact that lords were desperate to keep tenants on their land.
Okay, so explain the reversal. What did manorial records used to be?
They used to be the lord's proof of your obligations. The court rolls would say how many days you had to work, how much rent you owed. They were evidence of your servitude.
The Lord's weapon against you.
In a sense, yes. But with copyhold, that flips. When a tenant took on a holding, the details, the rent, the fees, the fact that it could be passed down in your family, were registered or copied in the court rolls.
And the tenant got a copy.
Crucially, yes, you got a physical copy of that entry. And over time, the royal courts started to accept that piece of paper as legal proof of the sanctity of his claim to his holding.
So the evidence of your oppression becomes the title deed to your property.
Perfectly put. The custom of the manor, which used to be whatever the Lord said it was, now became legally enforceable. He couldn't just kick you off the land or demand extra work anymore.
And that new security must have emboldened the tenants to push back on all the other little feudal rules.
It did. Over the 15th century, you see a clear trend. The tenants either pay a one-time fee to be free of the old obligations, or they just stop paying them.
These vicious or petty exactions, as the sources call them,
And they had these incredible archaic names, things like merchet.
which was the fee for your daughter to get married.
Right, a tax on family life. Or Harriet, the death tax, where the Lord took your best animal when you died, a crippling blow to a family.
They also got rid of jursum, chevage, ward penny, all these little payments that were designed to remind you of your unfree status.
And it wasn't a big legal battle. It was a slow, quiet resistance, a collective campaign of non-payment that the lords, who needed tenants, just couldn't afford to fight.
We even have dates for when these things finally petered out.
We do. On the Ramsay manors, these customary payments were formally relaxed in 1413. The last fine for not showing up to a boon work, one of those big harvest gatherings, was recorded at Elton in 1429.
A whole era just quietly closes.
It does. Yeah. But the social stigma, that took longer to fade. Even 100 years later, you could still insult a rising gentry family like the Pastons by pointing out they had a bondman, a serf, in their ancestry.
And we still have the residue of it in our language, which is amazing.
It really is. The word villain doesn't disappear. It just morphs into our modern word villain.
Tying low social status to moral evil.
Exactly. And its synonyms, boor and churl, they also hang around to mean someone with base or rude manners. The social prejudice is baked right into our vocabulary.
So despite those social scars, the 15th century is actually a time of rebuilding.
It is a time of recovery and consolidation. The survivors of the plague now have more land, individual farms get bigger, and the families that made it through see their prosperity increase dramatically.
And there were even some unexpected environmental benefits from the disaster.
Yeah. There were. With less pressure on the land, a lot of arable fields were turned back into pasture for animals.
More livestock.
Which means more manure. And that manure probably helped improve the crop yields on the fields that were still being farmed. So you get this positive feedback loop.
And new money starts flowing into the countryside.
Yes. Wealthy merchants from the towns looking for investments start partnering with these newly freed villagers in sharecropping deals. The sources say the conduct of village economy passed decisively into the hands of peasants, backed by townsmen's money.
The peasant is now an entrepreneur, not a serf.
Absolutely. And you can see this new prosperity physically in the architecture is a huge era of rebuilding. Peasant houses changed dramatically.
How so?
They started using stone foundations, stronger timber frames. They often added extra rooms or even a second floor.
And the big innovation, a fireplace and a chimney.
That's a massive change. Moving from a smoky, open hearth in the middle of the room to a proper chimney is a huge leap in living standards. It's a sign of permanence, of wealth.
It's a sign that this is your house now, a family home.
And it's not just the houses. The manor houses get bigger. And the parish churches, the heart of the village, get rebuilt in this grand, expensive new style, the perpendicular style.
You see it at Elton, The great square tower, the bigger aisles, the clerestory windows to let in more light. The whole village is physically building a more prosperous future for itself. So the village reaches this new kind of stability. Serfdom is gone, there's more wealth. But then another huge shock comes in the 16th century.
A massive institutional shock. The dissolution of the monasteries, starting in 1536.
Henry VIII, always needing money, just liquidates the church's assets. He suppresses all the great monasteries, like Ramsey Abbey, and seizes their vast land holdings.
And he sells them off for a colossal profit, maybe £1.5 million, which is a truly astronomical sum for the time.
And this completely redraws the social map of the countryside, because monasteries, for all their faults, were generally conservative landlords. They valued stability.
They did. But when Henry sold off the land, he created this huge new class of landowners. A chronicler at the time said, many new purchasers planted themselves therein.
And these weren't the old feudal families.
Not at all. They were entrepreneurs, merchants, lawyers, guys from the royal court. And their only goal was to make as much money from the land as possible, as quickly as possible. And as the sources say, not surprisingly, many of them saw the merits of sheep farming.
So this new, ruthless commercial mindset arrives in the countryside.
And it leads directly to the next great catastrophe, enclosure.
This had been happening slowly since about 1450, but it accelerates dramatically now. Grass becomes king, the international wool trade is booming, and it's way more profitable than growing grain for the local market.
So fields that had grown crops for centuries were just converted into sheep pasture.
And this meant destroying the very fabric of the medieval village, which was built on open fields and shared resources.
Enclosure was the systematic demolition of that cooperative world. It was pure economic rationalization. The famous lost village of Warren Percy is the classic example, totally erased from the map to make way for sheep.
And we know which villages were most at risk.
We do. The smaller, poorer ones, the ones with fewer free tenants because they had weaker legal rights and were easier to kick out, and especially the villages whose new landlords were connected to the wool trade.
The human cost must have been immense.
It was staggering. The new landlord would just wipe out the small farms. Families were evicted, forced to pack up everything and become landless migrants. Their houses just crumbled into ruins.
The entire landscape was literally erased. The ditches, fences, lanes, footpaths, all gone.
Often the only building left standing was the manor house, maybe with a few shepherds sleeping in the old servants' quarters. The entire purpose of the place had changed from supporting a community to exporting wool.
And this wasn't just a few isolated cases. The scale was huge.
It was. Maps show a clear link between the old open field farming areas and where these deserted villages are. One historian estimates, maybe with a bit of exaggeration, that 10% of the settlements of rural England had been erased from the landscape within 150 years of the Black Death.
And this is where we get that famous line, isn't it?
It is. The lament that the sheep were now devouring men instead of the other way around.
Yeah.
It's just brutal.
It's the dark side of market efficiency, and it obviously caused a huge backlash.
Oh, massive controversy. You get pamphlets, government inquiries, acts of parliament trying to stop it, all of them pretty ineffective. It even led to a big revolt in the Midlands in 1607, but the economic forces were just too powerful.
But not every village was destroyed. Some, like Elton, adapted.
They did. And other villages changed completely. They became industrial hubs. Craftsmen who wanted to escape the strict guild rules in the cities moved out to the villages, bringing their skills in weaving, dyeing, tanning.
Birmingham is the classic example. A small village that becomes this burgeoning town of 1,500 people specializing in tanning and cloth making, all because it didn't have those restrictive regulations.
And at the same time, actual farming was slowly getting better. Crop yields improved, finally reaching a general average of 7-to-1 by the 17th century. Famine, the great medieval terror, was largely becoming a thing of the past.
There were technological breakthroughs, too.
A guy named Roland Vaughan invented a new irrigation system in 1610 that helped solve the age-old problem of not having enough hay to feed your livestock through the winter.
So all these things, the market pressure, the new owners, the new technology, they all point in one direction.
The triumph of individualism. The old communal world was being replaced by a new, more dynamic, and much more divided one.
Divided between the rich and the poor.
Exactly. The old legal line between free and unfree was gone. Now, the line was between those who had capital and those who didn't.
The successful ones, the yeoman farmers, they could afford to buy up the old scattered strips and consolidate them into compact, enclosed fields with fences and hedges.
which freed them completely from the old communal rules about when to plant and when to harvest. They could do whatever they wanted.
And at the other end of the scale,
A huge increase in the number of landless laborers, totally dependent on wage work, which was often only seasonal.
the old cooperative system held on in a few places for a while.
It did. You see records from the 1540s of village courts still trying to enforce the old rules, but the decline was inevitable.
And our sources have a great summary of this whole process. The undermining of the common fields, the declining effectiveness of the village's internal government, and the development of a distinct group of wealthy tenants spelled the triumph of individualism over the interests of the community.
That's the final verdict. The cooperative foundation was gone.
And it's interesting, you see the English colonists in New England try to recreate that old system.
They did. They laid out villages with a green, with churchyards, with fields divided into strips. They had town meetings to make bylaws.
But it just didn't take.
It was out of place.
Yeah.
A system designed for a land-scarce, labor-rich society just didn't work in North America, which was vast and open and, as the source says, destined for exploitation by the individual homestead farm. The New World just reinforced individualism even more.
So let's bring this all home by looking one last time at Elton, this village that managed to survive everything we've talked about.
It's a fantastic case study. It survived the famine, the Black Death, the dissolution of Ramsey Abbey, which owned its land, and it survived enclosure.
And you can trace its history right through. Elton Hall was started around 1470, part of that post-plague rebuilding boom. It later passed into the hands of Henry VIII's queens, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr.
After that, it was eventually bought by Sir Thomas Cotton, who held what must have been one of the very last views of Frank Pledge, a really archaic kind of manorial court in 1633.
Which shows the old legal forms were still there, even if the real power was gone.
Exactly. And the descendants of that family still live there today, even though the old open fields have long since been replaced by hedged rectangles. It's a living link to that entire history.
But the world that was lost, that open field village, it was unique. Our sources call it a distinctive community, something new under the sun and not repeated since.
And there's this paradox at its heart. On the one hand, it was unthinkable without its lord. He was the center of the system. He got the rent and the labor.
But at the same time, the village had this high degree of autonomy. They ran their own affairs, regulated their own farming, settled their own disputes in their own courts with very little interference.
It was a self-governing cooperative. But we have to be realistic about the divisions within it. The legal line between free and unfree was probably less important in practice than the economic line between the prosperous and the poor.
It makes you think of that quote from this historian, Mark Bloch.
In social life, is there any more elusive notion than the free will of a small man? Even when you're legally free, the market pressures and the power of your wealthy neighbors, they create new kinds of bondage.
So as we wrap up, how should we think about these villagers? It's easy to either romanticize them or see them as brutish.
And the record suggests they were neither. Life was incredibly hard, strenuous, relentless, lived outdoors with a poor diet and almost no medicine.
But there was also this intense community. There was love, holidays, ale. There were neighbors who fought and sued each other, but who also depended on each other for everything, for plowing, for harvesting, for acting as legal pledges for one another.
And that gets to the most arresting characteristic of the whole system, cooperation. This idea of farming your own individual land, but doing it in concert with everyone else. Pasturing your own animals, but on common land. It was a system perfectly designed for an age of scarcity.
The final message from the records is that these were people much like ourselves, not brutes, not simpletons, just men and women adapting to an incredibly difficult world, one without science, without medicine, and with a deeply exploitative social system.
They adapted, they built things, they rebelled when they had to, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the very individualistic, market-driven world that would eventually sweep their own away.
So to sum it all up, we've traced this huge 300-year cycle. The end of the medieval village wasn't one event. It was this long process driven by demographics, by state pressure, by war, and by these fundamental shifts in the value of land and labor.
And the result was the total dismantling of a cooperative system in favor of market-driven individualism. And that brought huge gains in efficiency and wealth for some.
But it also created a landless class and destroyed thousands of communities in the process.
We tend to celebrate that triumph of individualism as the start of modernity, of economic freedom. But the medieval village, for all its problems, was built on a system of intense mutual solidarity. Cooperation was literally the key to survival.
And that leads to our final thought for you, the listener. Was something important lost when that communal tradition was dismantled, even as prosperity returned? That cooperative spirit, that absolute necessity of relying on your neighbors, was the defining feature of their world. So here's the question. Do we only truly recognize the importance of that kind of intense community and solidarity today when our own hyper-individualized system gets stressed or breaks down?